Hi there, welcome to this first podcast of House of Paul. I am Paul. I'm a former pastor and street preacher, and I thought I'd just give you my thoughts today on street preaching. So I've been a street preacher for quite a long time before I became a pastor. Preaching in the UK, I preach from probably as far south as Tavistock and Devon, and then right up in the north to Carlisle. I've preached on my own. I've preached as member of a team of preachers, but more often than not, I usually had somebody with me whilst I was doing that. And I just wanted to kind of give a little bit about my story, a bit of information really. About how I started street preaching and some of my experiences. So for the next half an hour to an hour, something like that, I'll just be sharing those experiences with you, my motivation, and perhaps that's something you might want to go before the Lord to consider yourself, whether you should be street preaching or whether, if you think the answer to that is no, whether you could help support others who are called by God to do that. So it really started probably back in about 2006, 2007, something like that, where I had a friend and we were having quite a few conversations about what was important. How do you reach people with the gospel? Because we'd come to the conclusion that, all right, filling your church with people is one thing, but if you fill your church with people who are not actually saved, then what is the point of that? Let's say you have a church of 120 and 20 of the people are genuinely born again, they're real Christians, but 100 of the people have simply joined your church. Then what that's going to do is that the 100 people who are simply what we might call nominal Christians, they're Christians in name only, are going to be affecting the minority. They are more than likely going to cause those who've recently become Christians to stumble, to take them away from what is really important. That the devil is going to use them to cause problems for those inexperienced believers. So we started to talk about what does the Bible say about how we are to communicate the gospel, because of course the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. That's the way that you bring somebody to Christ, is through that gospel. And so we started to look at things like Acts chapter 2, where Peter stands up and he raises his voice and he shares the gospel. And we also looked at Acts 17, where the Apostle Paul stands up at the Areopagus on Mars Hill and again starts to preach this very powerful message. And we started to say, well, surely that is the biblical way to bring someone to Christ. That's the example, that's the blueprint that we have of how somebody should become a Christian. We also have become very interested in discovering and reading the journals of people like John Wesley. And again, he used the same technique. They used to call it field preaching back in the day. So he would stand up and people would come from the farms and the houses and the villages nearby, and he would stand up there and just deliver to them the gospel. He would, and you can look at some of the sermons that John Wesley preached. They're in a book called 44 Sermons. Although there is actually a book called 53 Sermons, which are very good. And in it, John Wesley himself sort of recounts the kind of message that he preached to people on many occasions in the open air. So these were the kind of this was the kind of way we felt that the Spirit of God was leading us to consider that. And I remember my friend saying to me, well, this is how I see it happening, but I don't really feel called to do that. And I said, well, I think I could do it. I think I could put together a form of words in the same spirit and in the same, with the same sort of style, if you like, that I see in the scriptures and that I see in the journal of someone like John Wesley. And so I started to just really research preachers from the past, and what did they say, how did they say it, and that was fascinating. R.A. Torrey was one of the people that I looked at, and Charles Finney and people like that, just really to get an idea of how do you actually do this. What do you actually say? Do you say, do you start with sin and what sin is? Or do you start with the birth of Jesus Christ and his death and his resurrection? Well, how do you actually do it? How do you actually, because I started to realize that if you stood up in a public place and you started to share the gospel with people, the chances are that most of them, unless they were stood in a crowd, would only hear probably about 30 seconds of what you had to say. And that this then demanded a different kind of preaching. So this was very much on my mind, and we took a family holiday down in Devon. And this was the very first time that I street preached. It was in a place called Tavistock, and it was in the marketplace there. And also this had been on my mind. We were walking through the town there, just kind of looking around, doing a bit of sightseeing, I suppose. And we saw a doorway, and the door had a sort of fish symbol, a Christian symbol on it. And my wife said, "Oh, this is interesting. Let's have a look." And I was sort of saying, "Oh, it probably isn't anything. It's probably just someone's just put it up there, or it could have been there from previous owners, and it looks kind of a bit private. So we may not, perhaps we're not even allowed to go down there." But she said, "No, let's come and have a look and see what's at the end." So we kind of opened this door and we went down this passageway. And at the very end was a shop, like a Christian bookshop. And so, but it was all locked up. So we knocked on the door. And eventually an elderly lady came and opened the door. And we said, is this a Christian bookshop? And she was saying, "Yes, it is." She said, "It's a Salvation Army bookshop." And she said, "We don't really get many people coming down and looking round. But if you want to come tomorrow, you can come and have a look round, and I'll invite you for tea. You can come and have tea and cake with me." And we thought that was great, and just really showed, a kind of a humble heart and kind of hospitality. So we said, "Yeah, okay, well, we're here on a holiday. We'll do that." So we went down to see her the following day. And it turned out she had been, I think it was a lieutenant in the Salvation Army. She'd been a missionary to India, actually. And she let us have a look round. And so I was looking at various books. And I came across this tiny little red book. I don't know why it caught my eye, but anyway, it was very small, very thin. Pulled it out, and it said "The Doctrines of the Salvation Army." And it was written by William Booth, one of the great evangelists of any century. And so I bought the book. It's about $2.95 or something, and during that holiday I read at least most of it. But there was one section that was called something like "How to Get Men Saved," and it was all about open air preaching and how you do it. The words that you use, the technique that you should use. And it really helped to inform me on how I should do this, how I should approach this subject. Because you got to remember, in about 2006, 2007, there weren't many people in the UK street preaching. At least I didn't know of hardly any. Um, there was a guy in Manchester called Kevin Williams who was doing it, and there was a guy down south, Jim Gorley, who's a really nice guy. Had a really good chat with him and did a bit of outreach with him. But they were the only guys that I really knew who were doing it, and who were doing it in a way that I wanted to do it, or that I felt was the right way to do it. And so I started looking through YouTube, trying to find preachers, open air preachers, and I came across Kerrigan Skelly, if you know him, and so I wasn't on Facebook or anything like that, so I just emailed him. There was an email address or a website, and I emailed him, and he gave me some advice and so on. So I felt like, I could perhaps get started. And that's when my sort of journey, as they say, as a street preacher started to happen. Preached in various places around the UK. Preached in York and Lancaster, in Wales, places like Conway and Colwyn Bay, Llandudno, and then preached also sort of not too far from home. Preached in Stockport, Manchester, Macclesfield, and I tried to sort of use and employ these techniques, and had some interesting results. Some people were indifferent, some people were interested, and some people got very angry. And there was one occasion where I was preaching in Stockport, and a man came up to me, and he was very cross with what I was saying. I wasn't doing anything except preaching the gospel, biblical gospel, and he decided he was going to rip the Bible out of my hands. And I was literally just holding it with a thumb and forefinger. And he grabbed hold of the Bible with both hands, and by rights he should have just been able to easily take it off me. But it was almost like the Lord weakened him, and he couldn't take it out of my grasp. And I was thinking, this is really weird. What was happening? So he wasn't able to take it off me. So instead he decided to punch me, and I think he was aiming for my face, but it sort of landed at my chest, and it wasn't much of a punch, but it managed to knock me off the box that I was standing on. And that was my first sort of taste, really, of what you might call persecution. There've been all sorts of cases like that, really low level. I used to wear a badge with the name of our church on. Someone's ripped the badge off and thrown it in the bus lane, things like that. Of course, you get people shouting, "Shut up!" and so on. I was in Conway. I was preaching at the front there at the Quay. There was a bikers meeting taking place, and all these kind of hairy bikers kind of sat around drinking at the nearby pub. It was right next to a place called the Liverpool Arms, which is on the front of the Quay, and I was stood there, just started preaching the gospel. And as soon as I started preaching, about three of them all shouted, "Shut up!" You can actually see the videos on YouTube. I think if it's still up there. And but you get this all the time. And at the same place, there was a guy who came up to me. He was a Catholic, and he came out of the pub with a pint in his hand, and he sort of stood literally right in front of me and put the pint down on the floor. And he was kind of looking at me as if he'd never seen anything like this in his life. And when I'd finished, he came up to me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm preaching the gospel." He said, "I've never seen anything like that outside of a church." And I realized that the legacy of street preaching, the legacy of people like Wesley and Booth and so on, had just faded into well, not even into people's memories. It was just gone, and truly, people had never seen anything like that. It was bizarre to them, and yet that is the biblical blueprint for how we should be sharing the gospel. It's in that way, isn't it? So yeah, there's a lot of things like that that happened where we were resisted. The worst one I think was in Stockport, where I've been preaching, and I had two friends with me actually, who'd come along to support me. One had come all the way from Grimsby actually, and they were just kind of, the idea was that I was going to preach, they were going to support, and then we are going to go on to my friend's house afterwards and have some food, and and it was like, yeah, this is going to be really good. Meet up with old friends and so on. And I'd always been of the view that preaching in the centre of Stockport, there was like a CCTV camera, there were security guards around, quite often there were police there, and of course it was a busy Saturday afternoon. So you think, well, who's going to be stupid enough to try anything with all those sort of factors considered? Nobody is going to be stupid enough to try and assault me when I'm preaching the gospel with all that around. But I was wrong, and how it started was all a bit weird. There was a guy who's a Hare Krishna follower, devotee, and he came over, and I'd spoken to him before, and it was always he was always hostile. He was always, a bit aggressive. But I thought it was just going to be, verbal. And he came over, and I remember thinking, oh no, because he usually did something to stop the preaching. But I was trying to carry on, and but there came a moment where things really changed, where his whole demeanour changed, and he just started swearing at me. And I was like, "Oh, something's changed here." And as he was swearing, he said something like, "I'm going to knock you off that expletive box." And before I could gather my thoughts, that's exactly what he did. He punched me on the side of the head, and I fell off my box. I nearly blacked out, but there was a couple more punches came, and I kind of, when I kind of gathered myself and kind of looked up, I was lying on the floor, and my glasses were broken, and my box was somewhere else, and I was just lying on the floor. Um, and so one of my friends came over, and he was like to the guy, "Hey, back off, back off." And so he managed to get me up, and he said, "You all right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think so." And the guy who assaulted me walked off. But I thought, right, well, I'm not gonna put up with that. So I decided to carry on preaching, which was a mistake in retrospect. I should have just left, because Jesus says, if you're persecuted in this town, flee to the next. I didn't follow that principle, and he came back, and again he was very threatening, and in fact told me that if I continued preaching, he would kill me, and he repeated it several times, and I had no doubt that was how he felt about it. So I had no choice but to say, right, I'm not going to preach. But then he grabbed hold of the lapels of my jacket and headbutted me in the nose, and it was a very violent assault, and there was like blood all over my clothes, all over the pavement. There were bystanders just kind of staring, uh, not quite knowing what to do. In fact, one guy came running over with a wad of tissues and gave them to me, which I was very grateful for. But that was a really bad experience, and I think I went away thinking, can I really do this? Do I want to continue doing this? And anyway, by God's grace, I was able to kind of just kind of gather myself and think, okay, these things you've done it for years without this happening, and this is the one-off occasion. So I did. I continued preaching, went back to it, and just carried on in the next few weeks and so on. But sometimes it's not always the sort of the thugs or passers-by that are a hindrance to the gospel. Sometimes it can be the forces of law and order. I had one occasion where I'd been preaching in Marple, in Stockport, and a police officer came up to me. In fact, I just finished preaching. Police officer came up to me and said, "We've had complaints about you, and can I see your leaflet?" He read my gospel leaflet, and he was like, "Okay." He said, "Well, can you just move further up there?" I said, "Well, I've finished now, you know." And so he said, "Well, I just don't think that everybody in Marple appreciates you, appreciates your freedom to express yourself." I think that's how he put it, something like that. And I was like, "Sure, I don't expect them to." But Marple was a very difficult place to preach. So so the other occasion where I had this was when this person punched me in the chest. What happened afterwards was a police officer came running over, and I thought, he's going to come and sort out the situation. But what he did was he said to the person who assaulted me, "Right, you leave." And so the man obviously did leave. He didn't want any trouble. And then he said to me, "You can't preach here." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, it's restricted. It's private property." So I said, "Well, I beg to differ. I'd spoken to security guards and said they say it's fine for me to be here as long as I don't go on the other side of where the bollards were, that it was okay for me to stand here and to preach." And he's like, "Oh, well, let me just speak to my colleagues." So off he went, and eventually came back, and he said, "Well, apparently it is okay." So I was like, "So can I carry on preaching?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." So you've just got to be, know your rights, know where you're allowed to stand and where you're allowed to preach, and that is helpful. If you know those things, you can stand on your rights as a citizen, just like Paul did when he was about to be flogged and said, "Is it lawful to flog a Roman citizen? I'm a citizen." It's good to use our rights to get the gospel out there. So there was another occasion where I was preaching in Bristol. We're actually on the way to Bristol New Room, which is it's one of the chapels that John Wesley built, and he preached there. And so we were kind of just having a look at this chapel, but we had to go through the precinct to do it to get there. It was a bit of a weird setup, to be honest. You got this kind of really modern precinct, and then this old chapel sort of attached to it. So I went through the precinct, and I literally got up and started to preach, and these two security guards came running over to us and like, "Stop!" So I stopped preaching. I was like, "What?" And they're like, "You can't do that here." So I was like, "Right, I didn't know. I'm sorry." So they're like, "Oh, well," they're on these sort of earpieces to the management of the precinct who were talking to them. And I said, "Well, look, we won't preach anymore then. We didn't know that. Is it okay if we continue to shop? Is it okay if we just continue to buy a few things, and then we're going to go down here and do this? We won't be preaching." And he said, "Well, the management say, no, it's not okay, and you've got to leave the precinct straight away." And they said, "The only way you can do it is to get permission from the management to preach." So I said, "Well, is it likely that they're going to give us permission to preach?" And he said, "No." So it's like, that's okay. So that's clear then. So there have been quite a few occasions where it's not just been passers-by or people with an axe to grind, that it's actually been. But I tell you what, some of the worst people have been what you might call churchgoers, been stopped on several occasions by people who say, "I am a Christian and I think what you're doing is awful." Okay, So I remember having had a conversation with a young lady. She said, I am a Christian, and I think this is an awful way to try and persuade people to become Christians. And I said, okay. So I said, you see the majority of the people here walking through this precinct? I said, do you think they're Christians? And she said, no. So I said, well, what is going to happen to these people when they die? And she was very quiet. She sort of very quietly said to me, well, if they're not Christians, they'll go to hell. So I said, right. So I said, I've got an opportunity here to at least get them to think. I said, and look how many of them there are. There was like, 100 people walking past us. I said, so if I'm going to address them, I can't address them all individually, one by one. There's only me here. And let's say there was 5 of us. It's still quite a task to try and stop every single one and engage them in long conversations. So I said, I have to address them en masse. And the only way that I can do that and get them to hear is if I raise my voice or we have some form of amplification. I haven't got any amplification. This is another problem, is if you have amplification, the council can come along and say, well, it's not been properly tested. You can't use it. Or if it rains, as it often does in Stockport and Manchester, how do you use electronic amplification in the rain? So I said, what I'm trying to do is reach these people for Jesus in a biblical way and in a way that's going to be the most effective. So here's the thing. I started to come to a point where I wondered to myself, should I really be doing this? A lot of people didn't seem to like it. A lot of people, although some did, some encouraged you, prayed for you, and so on. I'm very thankful for that. But I started to think, well, have I been called to do this? Should I be doing this? For me, it was more a case of, Isaiah 6, verse 8. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, who shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. So my response has always been a kind of, here am I, send me. I'll go, I'll do it, I don't mind. But then I started to think, well, should I really be doing this? And I was involved in an outreach, and a guy got up to preach, to street preach. And as he started to do it, I was watching and I was listening, and it was just awful. It was, I'll use this phrase, he was like a bad actor. It sounded so insincere. It sounded like he was just there for him. It was all kind of over the top, melodramatic. And I started to think, is this what I'm like? Is this what I appear like to other people? And that concerned me because I didn't really want to be associated with that. When I read John Wesley's preaching and some of the other guys that I've already mentioned, their preaching, there was an intelligence about it. There was a thoughtfulness about it. It wasn't ranting, shouting, slapping the Bible in their hand. I know that appeals to some people, but it doesn't appeal to me. I don't see that in the scriptures. Even John the Baptist, who's sometimes put forward as this kind of gruff example, whilst there is something very sort of almost primitive about just a man standing up and raising his voice, nevertheless, what John the Baptist actually said has some sort of gravity and some truth. It has spiritual truth to it. It's not just kind of ranting about hellfire. There's a mixture in there. There is a call to repentance. There's compassion. There is warning, but it is more than just kind of ranting at people and condemning them. They stand condemned already. Don't need you to condemn them. Christ came, not that they should be condemned, but so that they might be saved. And I think this was, this was very much on my mind. And I kind of went away from that experience thinking, should I really be doing this? And is this the best way to do it? And I don't want to discourage anybody from street preaching, but is this the only way to do it? And I started to think, my zeal really started to flag, and I started to think, this is I don't want to come across like a bad actor. I mean what I say when I preach it. And so I came to the conclusion, there is good street preaching and there is bad street preaching. I know Paul says that he rejoices that, for whatever motive that the gospel is preached, but it's not really a question of motive. It's more, should the person be doing it? Have they been called? Have they been equipped to do it? And I think some have, and I think some haven't. And the ones that have should be doing it, and the ones that haven't should not be doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't witness for Christ and just share, the truth of the gospel with people that they meet. But there's only those who've been called by God who should be out there preaching. I encountered a couple of people who I want to mention. One is Tony Brown, who's a great guy, a good friend. And I went on a mission, mission trip to Chorley, of all places. There was a big Mormon what would you call it, festival there. And I went with a few guys down there to reach out to the Mormons, to bring them to Christ, hopefully. And we did a bit of an outreach in the town there. And Tony did it by putting up, he would have this big board and he would put on there write a question such as, is there life after death? I thought it was a great way of doing it, because people were coming over, yes, no, don't know, and it just engaged them in discussion about eternal things. And that was one of the things that I read in William Booth that he says we should do, is to just talk to people about what lies beyond this life, because quite often people are distracted from that, they're not thinking about it. And then there's another guy called Joe Kirby. Again, he's a lovely guy. He has the Off the Curb ministry and YouTube channel, and he had a board with sort of faces on it, and as he revealed each face, it was I think the question was, who was the most hated person in the world? And there was the face of, I think, Hitler, Jimmy Savile was another face, Stalin, and then the last one was, who is the most hated person? And it said sort of Jesus Christ. And that was great, because he got himself a bit of a crowd coming. He was very engaging personality, and he was talking and witnessing to people. And then there was that kind of shock ending. What, Jesus Christ was hated? And then he was able to talk to them about the crucifixion. So it really gave me kind of hope that the younger guys coming up, and there are some younger street preachers like Sonny Shoka, if you've heard him, he always gets a big crowd in Manchester. And it's great, but they, you need to be called by the Lord to be an evangelist. We can all evangelize, but it's something a bit different. So where that leaves me, I'm not sure. I'm kind of, whether I still want to go out and witness to people, still want to share the gospel, but should I be preaching? Well, that's maybe for you to say. But I would definitely carry on doing it if I felt that the Lord was calling me to it. But I don't want to be doing something that God is not calling me to, So, just want to encourage you to go and to share the gospel with others. You don't have to stand up in the middle of a shopping precinct and start preaching. But it is good to just get into the habit of sharing your faith with other people, and to sort of say to them, so what about you then? And to be kind of have a boldness that comes from the Lord to sort of say, well, when are you going to become a Christian? Rather than just saying, this is my faith and it's right for me, but I understand if you're not interested. We have to have that desire for people's salvation, so that we're not just willing to let it go, but that we can say to them, look, this is really important. This is your eternity, and whatever else you're going through in your life, don't forget about God. You need to make peace with God. You need to get right with God, and that essentially is what the gospel is all about, isn't it? It's like that's what it's all about. It's about getting right with God, and it's about turning away from sin and turning to God, and to have that eternal perspective, to sort of say, yeah, this is really important. This is the most important thing, to be right with God. All right, so hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Hoping to do some more, and think about some of the things that I've said. Think about how you can share your faith in the coming days, weeks, months, and read up on some of the people that I mentioned, particularly John Wesley. You can probably actually download his journals, I would have thought. But John Wesley, is a great preacher, and just encourage you to seek him out. Thanks.